What a lovely place this is. The subject is so vast, energy and environment, climate, relevance, taxation, that of course the profession has been discussing this for decades. So I will only scratch the surface. I'll try to fly over a number of topics that seem to me to be important, and I'll do more storytelling than theory. I was in the IPCC. I was the coordinating lead author of the chapter on policy instruments. And we noticed an interesting gap in the literature. We sat down to write, and I thought I'd write the summary first. A sketch of the summary. This is a 5-year process, writing this chapter on policy instruments. And I started off writing that, that the literature shows that carbon taxation is a good idea, basically. And then, tried to find literature supporting this, and I didn't find very much. And, the IPCC is evidence-based. I would have liked to see a few good published papers showing the experience of the carbon tax in Sweden, the carbon tax in Denmark, the carbon tax in Norway. People don't write articles like that. You don't get them published that way. Basically, you have to have some new interesting method or something to get published in a good journal. So there's actually a bit of a lack of literature. And I'll focus a little bit on the experience from some countries and some sectors. This is actually also a sort of a IPCC thing. A lot of people went berserk and very enthusiastic drawing maps. Look how the idea of carbon pricing is spreading from one country to the other, and there's some kind of progress. You have a map for 1980 and a map for 2000, and there are more and more countries getting colored. But the truth is that actually subsidies dominate the picture. We have, these figures actually come from the IMF, bizarre amount of subsidies. Fossil fuel. And there's an interesting lesson in this. I think the fossil fuel industry has dominated this industry, energy, for 100 years or more, and they have managed to accumulate a lot of subsidies. And there's a lesson there. I'll come back to subsidies at the end, I hope, if I have time. There's been a little bit of repeal. I want to say, some countries have actually quite successfully, this is also IMF stuff, some countries have repealed. I could take, Indonesia, Nigeria, these countries, they used to spend like half their budget subsidizing gasoline. Completely bizarre. In countries where there is not elementary health care for everybody, there is not water, there are sometimes not even roads, gasoline is subsidized. Well, obviously, you could think of who benefits from this, and it's not the poor, although that case is often said, but it's not true. I'll come back to that. I'll start with a little story, because you mentioned I work for the Environmental Defense Fund. It's a very strange organization. It's an NGO, but it's not like the NGOs I was used to in Sweden. This is an NGO with an annual budget of $200 million and a lot of power. Now, not enough power, because it's still very small power compared to the coal lobby, but still some significant power. So working there, I went on a number of occasions to Capitol Hill to talk to senators or congressmen, usually not the senator or the congressman. Each of these senators or congressmen is actually like a castle with about 100 people working for them. So you get to maybe to meet the chief of staff of a senator or something like that. And we had, my group at EDF would built a model working out the amount of, so this is a picture, screenshot from the model, working out how much revenue you would get from a carbon tax. And you could set this at either $5 a ton or $10 a ton or something. And you could work out, there was a lot of details there, but you could basically, you could see you get a lot of revenues, and then the carbon emissions would go down. And every time the reaction from the politician was the same. This was just a few years ago. The government was closing quite often because there was a lack of funds. This is a little bit embarrassing. And so the politicians, many of them, at least the ones I spoke to, they sort of say, yeah, that revenue really looks interesting. And then the carbon going down, that's good too. You know, that's good for the environment. But then they would sort of say, well, it's hard to imagine like having such a high carbon tax, $5 or even $10 a ton. And then it was kind of fun to say, yes, I come from a little country where we have a carbon tax of, at the time it was actually 160, but the dollar has gone up, so now it's $120 per ton. And the interesting fact, the most striking fact that I found that really gets people excited is that most Swedes have not noticed. Right? Because the people I've spoken to in the US, they thought that people would be so depressed in Sweden that this would be the explanation of the famous suicide rate that we have. But it's not. I've asked when I lecture in Sweden, I asked my audience, have you thought about the carbon tax today? Typically they haven't, right? They think about other things. Where's my boyfriend and where's my next espresso? And life goes on, right? And so I showed a map before with all these countries that have carbon taxes or tradable permit schemes. But the truth is that most of these have prices that are very close to zero. So it isn't really much of a result. It isn't really much of a policy. And Sweden has this really high carbon tax, so it's an interesting case to study. Now, Sweden is minuscule, as I'm sure many of you know, and it's a very open economy. The economy consists of some 20 very big companies that are mainly active abroad. And so we can't really have an industrial policy that is enormously different from other countries. That becomes difficult. So basically, this carbon tax applies mainly to domestic use. That's all kinds of heating, residential, commercial, transport, of course, some agriculture and some other stuff. And for industry, it's a much more complicated story. There's been some partial taxation. For some years, industry was paying 25% of that tax. It was still a very high tax compared to other countries. But then there were some exceptions, and then they also had to buy the EU permit, and then they started complaining to court saying that they were taxed twice because they paid, you know, and so. And now the big industries just pay the permits. I want to say something about how this tax was possible and what effects it's had. And there are a few studies, but there's relatively little literature on this. But one thing is, first of all, there was a context. You don't do tax reforms very often. There's a great resistance to changing taxes everywhere. It's something you do every 35 years, is change the tax system. And Sweden had very high marginal taxes. According to anecdotal evidence, just above 100%. And this made even Swedes complain, right? So there was a great pressure, and the nasty conservative sort of rallying cry was that leave us half our income, which compared to other countries is quite a modest demand from the right wing, right? But they basically wanted to cap the taxes at 50%. And so there were a lot of things on the table, right? Wealth tax, inheritance tax were abolished, property tax was modified, the VAT tax was broadened. That's quite important. The tax system was enormously simplified. This is the instrument that youngsters use. They say, oh, you have to do tax declaration, your declaration once a year. You sort of do this, and that's it. Now, this used to be something that 20 years ago, people would sit down with their accountants for 3 weeks. And now you just click on the phone, and it's all really very standardized, very simple, and very flat taxes. So some of the progressivity went out the window. That's a pity. Now, and in this context, energy was more heavily taxed. Value-added tax was applied to energy taxes. Value-added taxes applied to the environmental taxes on energy. So there's a, there are energy taxes, and then there's value-added tax not only on the energy but also on the taxes. This whole system was made much simpler, more transparent. But the result was a very big carbon tax. Right? You can see some numbers here by comparison. France just succeeded the third attempt. They had 3 big national processes that took a lot of time and effort, and the first 2 failed, and the third one, finally, they got a tax. But it's still quite small compared to the Swedish tax. So this was possible because there are people who don't like taxes in Sweden too. But basically they got reduction in the marginal taxes, they got rid of the inheritance taxes, they got a lot of other change, they got a lot of simplification that was very popular. And then there was a big carbon tax, and somehow that was somehow just accepted. The revenue is not that big because the use of fossil fuels has gone down. And so that's, but it's a couple of percent. It's about 3% of total tax revenues. The result of this tax, big surprise, is a certain amount of decoupling. Emissions are going down, although GDP is going up. Not a big surprise. Note, however, that the carbon emissions have not gone to zero. I mean, not even in the transport sector, which actually is paying this full price. Actually, in the residential sector, they have gone quite close to zero. Speaking of the heating sector, we have a cold climate, and yet we use less energy for heating. Typically, now we're going to do a little bit more studies on this and on the building sector eventually, but as far as we can see, in Sweden, we use less energy for heating than you do in a lot of other European countries that are a lot warmer. So we insulate the buildings. That's number one. And there are buildings in Sweden that use zero energy and have no heating system, no chimneys, no furnaces, nothing. Right? They just use passive heat. And yes, they have quadruple glazing windows with argon between the window panes. And so the window is expensive. But you save quite a lot of money by not having a heating system. So it's still quite a cheap and attractive house. We also have a lot of district heating. So this is basically a public collective form of heating for a whole city. And this even down to small cities, so ranging from the big cities to the bigger villages or small cities. We have district heating, and you can see this system has been growing. Now accounts for a rather large share of heating in Sweden. And the composition of fuel has changed. It used to use oil, this system, and it now uses wood. And since we manage the forest sustainably and plant the same number of trees as we cut, we consider that there is basically no carbon dioxide associated with using wood. Wood that is nowadays called biomass, but it's still wood, basically, right? Although sometimes processed in various ways. And typically it is the residuals from the timber industry. So it's wood that you wouldn't use for something else otherwise. There's also heat pumps, there's industrial cogeneration, there's all kinds of other little interesting things. Another important point that I noticed had a lot of effect when speaking to Republicans in the United States was that this gigantic carbon tax did actually not mean that taxation in Sweden increased. In fact, it's the opposite. Taxation in Sweden during the last 20 years has gone down as a share of GDP. It's just one tax that went up. Other taxes went down, right? These are two independent things. I'm saying a lot of obvious things here. It's, it's kind of obvious. Now, you saw before I said that this led to some decoupling. Well, in all honesty, we've had decoupling in a lot of places. So the tons of carbon dioxide per dollar of GDP has been going down all over the world. But if you look carefully at this diagram, you'll see that Sweden was one of the lowest already to start with, and it's actually been falling faster. I have it in index form here. It's been falling faster in spite of the fact that it started low. Sweden has been decarbonizing faster than other countries. This is some kind of anecdotal evidence that the carbon tax has had effect. This is not the same thing as doing a proper study because 4 hours left? Okay. So this is another very embarrassing thing to say to professional economists, but the unemployment rate is not higher in Sweden. Now, professional economists, the researcher wouldn't expect it to be, right? We don't expect the unemployment rate to be a function of the carbon tax, but other people seem to think that they are related and that you get a lot of unemployment, right? So it's kind of a thing worth saying. I've spent a lot of time studying. We also have policies on NOx. Enormous cost of NOx in Sweden. And so I've looked at these synergies. I will skip some details here and just tell you the conclusion, which is here, that carbon dioxide and NOx emissions are substitutes, and the carbon policy actually seems to have increased, no, the NOx policy seems to have increased our carbon emissions. So, did I say that the wrong way around? The carbon policy increased our NOx emissions. It could go either way, because it depends on which has the higher price, right? But these policies, you basically, for the reasons of NOx, you would like a high temperature in the furnace, a low temperature in the furnace, and for reasons of carbon dioxide, you would need a high price. And so these are substitutes. I would like to say something about the transport sector. So, and again, I'll do this with pictures. I've spent years, I've written a dozen articles estimating elasticities and stuff, but actually you can see everything in this picture, which has the price. Italy has always had a very high price of gasoline, and the United States always very low because the differences of taxation. And big surprise, the US, they use a lot more gasoline per person than in Italy. This is, if you work out, do the econometrics, you see there's a price elasticity of about minus 0.7 in the long run. So this kind of shows, we can aggregate this to the level of the whole OECD. The OECD uses about 1 gigaton of fuel per year. And if we hadn't had carbon taxes in gasoline taxes, which I call sectoral carbon taxes, if we hadn't had that in Europe, we would have used about 1.5. That is, if we'd had the same low prices. So gasoline taxes are the only policy to date that has had any effect on the ppm. You know, we just passed 400 ppm in the atmosphere. It would maybe have been 410 or 20 otherwise if we hadn't had gasoline taxes in Europe. It's the only policy that has had any effect. Maybe the Chinese one-child policy, I don't know. Certainly the ETS is not visible on this scale. Now, people use very frequently the argument against gasoline taxes that it would be bad for the poor. And so I've looked at this. I've written a book about it. There was one paper already, so that you gave. So this is, you look at the share of expenditure, either income or expenditure. You get slightly different figures. I won't go into this more because there's already been one paper about this today. But if you look at developing countries, you see a pattern like this. This is for Kenya. Practically all the gasoline is used by the richest. It is the same in India and in China. And even if you count, I mean, there's diesel in public transport and so on, if you add up the total, you still get a pattern of considerable increasing shares where the rich use much more. So if you take a global perspective, it is the rich that use gasoline. That doesn't mean that carbon taxes are always unproblematic, because there are other fuels that are used by the poor. If you looked at kerosene, for instance, you would find that's mainly used by the poor. But when we speak of gasoline, it is typically used by the rich. And it's typically a progressive tax in most countries. So I'm feeling a little rushed. I see what I have a number of other points that I wanted to mention. There's an interaction between taxation and other policies, standards, policies like refunded emission payments that we have on nitrogen oxides, permits. Many places, permits and taxes are used at the same time. There's an interesting set of hybrid instruments being developed, tradable permits which have a floor and a ceiling, or the equivalent of taxes which have a tax with an adjustable tax level if you don't meet your target. Now you can construct these more complex hybrid instruments. I also want to say something very briefly about the importance of technology policy. I think we are, on the whole, failing to implement what would be the best instrument, that is taxation. Fossil fuels are still basically subsidized. In that situation, I think there's a lot that speaks for technology policy. And for instance, the technology policy that Germany has had promoting renewables. But the details are important here. That policy will not completely replace. We still need a price on carbon. Even if all the roofs in the world were solar and all the cars electric, that wouldn't help if there wasn't a price on carbon, because fossil fuels are very useful, and people will just, the equilibrium price of oil and coal would fall if we did all the above mentioned. If there was no tax, people would all have heated swimming pools in the winter and find new uses for oil and coal, and we would have both renewables and oil and coal. So we need a price on carbon. The point of technology policy is that it will make it possible to get there, because we help weaken the fossil lobby. It is the fossil lobby. It's not because it's expensive. It's because there is a powerful lobby stopping carbon taxation. That's the reason why the politicians find it so difficult to do. And the true reason why Sweden can have this high carbon tax is that Sweden has no fossil industry. So there wasn't a strong lobby against it. So we spend too much time, it's fun, we spend too much time on designing optimal policy instruments and not enough time thinking about lobbyism, because the political economy of instruments is really where some of the vital action is. Oh, I will stop there just because of the buses and the food and